Hello everyone, and welcome again to chesslecture.com. My name is Dana McKenzie. Today I'd like to talk about discovered attacks and discovered checks. But actually before we get started on that, I had a completely separate issue that I wanted to talk about with you and share feedback on. Here at Chess Lecture, we love listener feedback. And this is a question that actually I don't really know the right answer to, and so I'd like to know what you all think. So it involves a little bit of a story. So recently I was playing in a chess tournament, a little invitational chess tournament we have in the town I live in, the tournament's called the Santa Cruz Cup. We have it every year. We have 8 people playing in it, and we do sort of like a World Cup where we play a round-robin qualification round, and then we do some 2-game mini-matches elimination matches to determine the winner. And in these 2-game elimination matches, if they're tied after 2 games, we then go to a 25-minute playoff game. And then if it's still tied, well, we have 2 of those. If it's still tied, we play 2 10-minute playoff games. And if it's still tied after that, we play 2 5-minute playoff games. And if it's still tied after all of that, we do something called Armageddon, which is a kind of tiebreak that was instituted for the FIDE World Championships last year, and it's been also used in a few other world tournaments. The idea of Armageddon is that you play just 1 game, and of course, if you play 1 game, then white has the advantage, and so there'd be a very distinct advantage to the person who's lucky enough to get white for that game. So to compensate for that, the rules of Armageddon say that if black draws the game, if the game is a draw, then black will actually be considered the winner. And so basically white has to either win or go home. Now, it's considered that that's a little too much of an advantage for black, and so to compensate for the draw odds, they give white a time advantage where white has 6 minutes and black has only 5 minutes. So we had decided on these tie-breaking procedures for our tournament, and what happened was last night I was playing these playoff games with my opponent, who's a good friend of mine, a guy named Juan Diego Perea, and sure enough, we split the 25-minute games 1-1, and we split the 10-minute games 1-1, and we split the 5-minute games 1-1. Incidentally, black won every single game last night, which was pretty weird. And so then we're facing this Armageddon thing, and neither of us wanted to play the Armageddon game because it seemed to us like it'd be just like a coin flip. Given the fact that black's won all of his games last night, whoever gets black in this Armageddon game, especially with draw odds, looks like they're going to win. And so basically, the coin flip is going to decide the winner of the tournament. And we just decided we didn't like that, and so we decided to be co-champions. And this, of course, was greeted with some, shall we say, disappointment by the other people in the tournament who really, there were 2 people, 2 of our friends who are also watching this, and they wanted us to play on. They were having a great time watching these exciting playoff games, and they wanted to see a winner. They didn't want to see co-winners. So, but we basically said no. We'll just split the title, and we'll be co-champions. And so, so I'm just kind of curious what you all think about this situation. I guess I have 2 questions. First of all, should we have gone ahead and played the Armageddon? Were we just wimps, which is what one of my friends said we were. And then my second question is, what do you think about Armageddon? Is this actually a reasonable way to break a tie in a tournament? What about, in the World Chess Championship? If this hadn't been for just the championship of Santa Cruz, but a world championship, is this really a fair way to decide a world champion, with 1 Armageddon game that lasts 5 minutes for each side, or 5 minutes for one side and 6 minutes for the other? And is this real chess when you have draw odds for 1 player? So I'd be really interested in your feedback, because this could have come up last year in the FIDE World Championship, and someday we may even have a world champion decided by an Armageddon playoff. And I think it's worth thinking about. Okay, let's go on now to the main subject of the chess lecture I wanted to give today, which is discovered checks and discovered attacks. Now, discovered checks are an extremely useful tactical motif that I think you'll be able to spot in a lot of your games. And they're kind of interesting because they're usually very strong, but not always. And we'll see examples sort of on both sides of this equation in my lecture. So let's start out with this position that you see in front of you. This is from a very famous game between a Mexican player named Carlos Torre and a former world champion named Emanuel Lasker in 1925. So Torre is white, Lasker is black, and it's white to play in this position. Now Lasker has just moved, black has just moved his queen to b5, which turns out was a very unfortunate choice for him, for reasons that we're going to see. But you can see what black's idea is. He's trying to set up a pin. He's pinning this bishop on g5 so that if it moves away, for example, back to f4 or something, black would win white's queen. Okay, obviously white doesn't want that to happen. Okay, but on the other hand, the bishop on g5 is being attacked by the pawn on h6, so it looks as if white's just going to lose a bishop in this position. But looks can be deceiving. So Torre in this position plays a beautiful, brilliant move, bishop to f6. So he's offering a queen sacrifice, which really black has to take, because if black doesn't take the queen, he'd have his own queen is being attacked by white's queen, so he'd have to move his queen away, and then white would get a tremendously strong rook takes pawn check and basically win in 2 or 3 moves. So black really has no choice here. He's got to go queen takes queen. And now Torre plays rook takes pawn check. Now, perhaps why Lasker didn't see this coming is that it doesn't look so dangerous at first blush, because this isn't a checkmate. You know, black can easily get his king out of check with king to h8. But the trouble is that this sets up a beautiful series of discovered checks. So let's see the first one. White plays rook takes pawn, discovered check. Now, what do I mean by discovered check? Okay, the thing to notice, if we back up a move, is that white's bishop would be attacking black's king if it weren't for the fact that white's rook is in the way. And so all white has to do is move the rook out of the way, and that will create a check, which is called a discovered check. And the reason we call it discovered is that it's sort of a surprise. You know, you don't expect it. It's because the piece that's moving is not the piece that gives the check. So it's kind of a surprise check in that way. So the rook moves, but it's the bishop that gives the check. Similarly, you can talk about discovered attacks, which is if one piece moves out of the way of another piece, thereby unveiling or discovering an attack on your opponent's piece. That's a discovered attack. So what Torre played in this position was the discovered check, rook takes pawn. And let's talk about what makes discovered checks and discovered attacks such a strong tactical motif. The thing is, ordinarily, white's rook would have no business taking that pawn on f7 because black could simply go queen takes rook. So the rook has moved to a place that it would ordinarily be forbidden to move to. But because black has to get out of check, the rook on f7 is invulnerable. It can't be taken. So it's kind of a way of putting this, cloak of invulnerability on your pieces so that they can't be taken. So it's really a neat thing. Okay, so black again has only one move in this position to get out of check, and that's to go king to g8. Now here, if you didn't know about the power of discovered checks, you might be tempted as white to just go, say, rook takes bishop. But that would actually be a bad move, because after all, white sacrificed his whole queen, and getting just a bishop back isn't enough compensation for it. So rook takes bishop would not be enough. So instead of doing that, Torre once again plays rook to g7 check. Now it looks like he's not making any progress because black just moves back to h8. But the thing is, each time that black moves his king back to h8, white's going to get another discovered check and take another piece of black. Okay, so he's just going to munch all black's pieces one after another. Bang, bang, bang. Okay, so rook takes bishop. And see, now the whole point of this is that it's rook takes bishop check. And so white immediately has to defend the check and does not have time to consolidate his position and maybe save his queen. So again, black has to play king to g8. White comes back to g7 one more time, plays a check, and again, black has no other move than king to h8. And now white could play rook takes pawn check if he wanted to, but actually he prefers not to because he doesn't want to open the a file. Instead, white just goes rook to g5 check, and now he's going to pick up black's queen. And once again, notice, the rook could be taken by the pawn, except that black isn't allowed to do that. He's got to get out of check. And so basically, again, the discovered check is just like a free pass for white's rook to go anywhere it wants. So an amazing situation. Okay, so again, black has only one way to get out of check, which is king to h7. And then white plays rook takes queen. And so we can now see that white has gotten a queen, a bishop, and a pawn for the queen that he gave up. Now, as it turns out, by happenstance, black can actually win the bishop back because he plays king to g6 with the fork on the rook and the bishop. And then white moves his rook back. Black goes king takes bishop. But white then goes rook takes pawn check. And at this point, the tactical melee sort of clears, and we can see that white has ended up with a 3-pawn advantage, which, of course, is more than enough for him to win. And so, in fact, Tori won this game in, it took him about maybe 10 or 15 more moves. So, one of the most beautiful and justifiably famous combinations in chess history. And actually, this whole idea, this whole setup of the repeated rook to g7 check, followed by the repeated discovered checks, actually has a name of its own. It's called the windmill. Okay, so you might actually see this sometimes. It's pretty rare, but still, it's a nice thing to know about the windmill attack. So that's one interesting thing about this position. Another thing I want to point out, now that you've seen the windmill and understand how it works, is that the very first move of white also is, in a manner of speaking, a discovered attack, because so you can see that white moved his bishop out of the way of his queen and discovered an attack on black's queen. And of course, we kind of saw this as a queen sacrifice, but it's also a discovered attack. If black had tried to defend against the windmill with a move like g6, which stops all that other stuff, then black would have just lost his queen. So again, we see that even before all the exciting discovered checks on black's king, we also had a discovered attack on black's queen. So another cute little example. Now, before we go on to our next example, I want to mention that this game is kind of interesting historically also, because Carlos Tori won this game when he was 21 years old. And of course, for a 21-year-old upcoming master to absolutely thrash a former world champion with such a beautiful sacrifice made him, an instant, instantly famous in the chess community. And, you'd have to think this guy could have maybe been a world champion himself. But unfortunately, he had what they called a nervous breakdown later that year and never played another competitive game of chess again. So, in a way, it's a beautiful game, but also very sad, because you look at this and you think about what might have been. This Carlos Tori could have been the next world champion and could have been, the greatest player in Mexican history, at least. But sad to say, this was, only a tantalizing glimpse of what he might have accomplished. Okay, so from our example from 1925, I want to jump to another example, which is much more recent, from just last year. All right, our next example is a game that took place in the North American Open in 2006. It's a game between Jerry Hankin as white and Jose Hernandez Torres as black. And Hankin is a well-known master in the U.S., and he actually is a frequent writer for Chess Life magazine, and he, in fact, wrote about this game in Chess Life in the current issue, the March 2007 issue. So if any of you are interested in seeing the whole game and his very interesting comments on it, you should definitely get a copy of that if you don't have one already. All right, we're looking here at the position after black's 23rd move. So it's white to play. Black has just moved his knight to c4, forking white's queen and bishop. And as Jerry Hankin comments in his Chess Life article, this looks pretty good for black, because if he can trade off white's bishop, then that will get rid of one of white's most dangerous pieces and probably give black a little bit of an advantage. So in this position, Hankin played a really surprising move, but if you think about our last example and you think about the windmill attack, you might be able to see what Hankin is going to play here, because we're going to get the windmill all over again. Take a moment and look at it and see if you can figure out how white sets up the windmill. Okay, so what white plays is e6. So this is a beautiful kind of a discovered attack where white is now opening up the long diagonal from a1 to h8, and his bishop on b2 is attacking black's pawn on g7. And so we once again have this combination of a bishop and a rook both bearing down on g7. Now, of course, Hankin is sacrificing his queen. But if black were foolish enough to take the queen, knight takes queen, then we would get a winning combination, very much like the game we saw between Torrey and Lasker, where Hankin would play rook takes g7 check. Black only has one move, king to h8, and now white just starts gobbling up all of black's pieces. Rook takes pawn, discovered check. Black again has only one move, king to g8. Rook to g7 check, chasing black back to the corner. King to h8. White gobbles up another piece, rook takes bishop. And black's king has to come back to g8. White checks again on g7. Black again has to go to h8. And now, instead of gobbling up any more pieces, white would simply play rook back to g5 or g4 with a discovered check. And now it's almost checkmate. The only thing black can do is interpose his rook. And then white would play bishop takes rook, checkmate. So here we again see the windmill in action with the repeated rook checks going both directions. So it would have been a lovely way for the game to end. Now, in this case, unlike the Torrey-Lasker game that we saw, black does not have to accept the queen. He doesn't have to take the queen sacrifice. And so, in fact, black played a different move, which turned out very badly for him. Black played in the game f6. And this then led to a very rapid victory for white with queen to h6. Okay, again, a double attack on the g-pawn. Black has no way to defend except to push the g-pawn. But now white just moves his rook over to the h-file, rook to h4. Okay, and this threatens checkmate on h7. And again, black has no really good way to defend. The only thing black can do is play rook to f7, which in fact he did. And then Hankin played pawn takes rook check. And at this point, black resigned, because after king takes pawn, white plays queen takes pawn check, and the attack is just too strong. The queen and the rook are gobbling up black's king. And besides, white's already won a rook. So there's really not much more point in playing on here for black. Okay, so once again we see, well, this is a good lesson for you. It's good to know the chess classics because, and I'm sure that Hankin knew about that game between Torrey and Lasker, and so that gave him the inspiration for this move. Now, one thing that Hankin talks about in his lecture is, in his Chess Life article, is actually black has a pretty good defense here. The best move for black would have been g6. And in the Chess Life article, he gives a pretty long-winded computer analysis to show that white can win this position as well. I think that would be a little bit too much of a digression for us here, but if you want to see how that works, definitely look up his lecture. The main thing that I want to emphasize here is just the windmill attack, the discovered checks, and also perhaps a little bit of the psychological impact of a discovered check. That, you know, when you make a move like this and sacrifice your queen, it really throws your opponent for a loop sometimes. And, you know, black didn't find the best defense here, perhaps because he was too shocked by this whole queen sack hitting him unexpectedly. Okay, for our next example of a discovered check, I want to show you one that you might be able to actually use in your own games. This is a famous opening trap. So this will show a discovered check right in the opening. And also, this will illustrate, I think, again, the theme of some of the themes of why discovered checks are so strong. So this opening begins with e4, e5, knight f3, and black plays knight f6. So this is called the Petrov Defense. Not all that popular, but still pretty good defense for black. And it kind of looks as if black is playing copycat here. And so I want to show you the dangers of playing copycat, because what I'm going to show you is what happens if black does too much copycat. So white plays knight takes pawn here, which is one of the two book moves for white in this position. And now the book move for black, really the only correct move for black here, is d6, attacking the knight. But if you're playing a beginner who doesn't know the openings very much, black might assume that he can just go on copycatting white and playing knight takes pawn. Why not? Okay. Well, doing this leads to a neat old trap based on a discovered check. So white plays queen to e2, attacking the knight. Now, what should black play here? Well, his knight's under attack, so he has to do something about that. But if he plays knight to f6, then that opens it up for a discovered check. Okay, so do you see it? White would now play knight to c6, discovered check. And this attacks black's king, but also, more importantly, the knight on c6 is attacking black's queen, and black has no way to get the queen out of the attack, because he's got to get out of check first. Okay, so, for example, if he plays bishop to e7, then white goes knight takes queen. Or if he plays queen to e7, white plays knight takes queen. So either way, black loses his queen. And you know, to me, this once again emphasizes what's so good about discovered checks. They're what I call a 2-for-1 move, because white's doing one thing, playing check with his queen, and at the same time he gets a free move with his knight to go anywhere he wants. And so the knight gets to attack another piece, and of course he attacks the most valuable piece of all, which is black's queen. So there are many other kinds of 2-for-1 moves in chess. We've already discussed in my previous lectures forks, which are simultaneous attacks on two pieces, and skewers, which are another kind of simultaneous attack on two pieces. So any time in chess when you can attack two things at once, it's likely to be a strong move. And so if you look for these 2-for-1 moves, you'll become a much better player. See, it's easy for your opponent to defend if you attack one thing at a time. If you're just attacking one thing at a time, he can defend one thing at a time. You attack a piece, he moves it. You attack a piece, he moves it. No one can ever win. But if you attack two pieces at once, he's not allowed to move them both. And so that's when you can actually win material, and in this case, win some big material. Incidentally, also, we could have played knight to g6 check and win black's rook if we'd wanted to, but of course it's much better to win the queen. Now, of course, if black sees this coming, he might, instead of moving the knight back, it's probably more likely that he will try to defend the knight with, say, a move like d5. But that's okay. Then white would just attack the knight with d3. And once again, the knight can't move back because white has this lethal discovered check. So instead, basically, black would have to give up the knight, and so white would end up a piece ahead in material. So, ironically, the best move for black in this position is to continue the copycat strategy with queen to e7, because it turns out that after queen takes knight, black would play d6, and white cannot move his knight away because it's pinned. He'd lose his queen. So, in fact, in this position, white would have to play d4. Black does win back the piece, but white now is a pawn up and has a very strong position. So white has a clear advantage in this situation. So the moral of the story for black is don't play copycat chess. So instead of doing that knight takes pawn, he should have done d6 earlier and chased the knight away earlier. So that's a nice little opening trap to know about, and once again, based on this idea of discovered check. All right, for our next example of a discovered check, I'd like to show you a game that is not much longer than the one we just looked at, but this is actually a famous game, again, an old chestnut. This is between Richard Reti as white and Savieli Tartakower as black. They were both very strong players. This was played back in 1910 in a tournament in Vienna. And Reti is white, Tartakower is black. And we'll see a really beautiful combination based on the idea of discovered check. Starts with e4, c6. This is called the Caro-Kann defense. White plays d4, black plays d5. So far, very standard opening. White plays knight to c3, black goes pawn takes pawn, white goes knight takes pawn. Again, this is all fairly standard, and black plays knight to f6, attacking white's knight in the center. Now, here, Reti, as white, plays an interesting move that you don't see very often, which is queen to d3. The reason you don't see this move very much is that it brings white's queen out a little bit too early. But it's actually, it's not clear that this is all that bad for white. One interesting point about this move is that black might be tempted to play bishop to f5, which is setting up a pin on the knight on e4 so that the knight can't move away, or so it appears, because white would lose his queen. Now, actually, this would be a big mistake for black, though, because white can move the knight away. He'd go knight takes knight check. And here we have another example of a discovered attack. This time, it's not a discovered check. It's the piece that's moving out of the way that's giving check, but the effect is the same. Black has to defend against the check, so he might, for example, go pawn takes knight, and then he loses the bishop because of the discovered attack on the bishop. So once again, we see the theme of discovered attack. All right, so the piece moves out of the way of the queen, discovering an attack on the bishop. Well, black did not fall into that one, actually. He will fall into discovered check later, but he didn't fall into that one. So instead, black played a move e5, which turned out to be a serious blunder. But in a way, it's too bad, because this is actually the kind of move I would like to play if I were black in this position. But it just doesn't work for tactical reasons. Black is basically trying to shake white's position up a little bit and challenging the center. But it turns out he loses too much time. Okay, white goes pawn takes pawn, and then black plays queen to a5 check. So clever little trick here, forking white's king on e1 and the pawn on e5. So after white plays bishop to d2, then black plays queen takes e5. And I'm sure Savieli Tartakower saw this and thought, wow, this is pretty good for black, because now, once again, he's got a pin on white's knight on e4, which can't move away, and it's being attacked twice. So I'm sure Tartakower thought that white would have to play something like f3 to defend the knight, a very passive move. And now black could continue turning up the pressure with something like bishop to f5, and black would have a really good game. Well, unfortunately, Reti had a surprise in store for him. Reti played castles long, okay, giving up the piece, giving up the knight on e4. Now, black has two ways to take the knight, but one of them is obviously bad. Okay, so queen takes knight is no good because white would play rook to e1, and this pins the queen against the king, and so it basically wins black's queen, which would give white a material advantage even though he sacrificed a knight to start with. So queen takes knight is no good. But what about knight takes knight? There's nothing wrong with that. Now if white goes rook to e1, black can defend the knight with something like f5 and have a decent game. Well, instead of playing rook to e1, white comes up with a beautiful combination here, and one of the most surprising combinations I've ever seen. He plays queen to d8 check, giving away a whole queen. And the whole idea behind this move, of course, black has to go king takes queen. There's no other move. The whole idea behind this is simply to set up a discovered check. Bishop to g5 check. And actually, this is a special kind of discovered check called a double check, because white is attacking black's king both with his rook on d1 and with his bishop on g5. Double checks are a special kind of 2-for-1 move, and they're especially strong because there's only one way to respond to a double check. It forces your opponent to move his king. You know, ordinary checks can be defended in 3 different ways. You can either move your king, or you could interpose a piece. So ordinarily, black could interpose his bishop, say bishop to d7 to defend the rook check, or bishop e7 to defend the bishop check. Or the third way to defend against checks is to take the checking piece. So if this were an ordinary check, black could play queen takes g5 and, you know, just win a piece. So, but none of those options are available to black because he has to defend 2 checks at once, and the only way to do that is to move his king. So black has only 2 options available. One of them is king to e8, but then he would be checkmated by rook to d8 check. Or the other way is king to c7, which is what Tartakower played, but then again he's checkmated, bishop to d8, checkmate. An incredibly pure checkmate is a unique example where white has only 2 pieces developed, the rook and the bishop, and yet they're able to checkmate the king. And black has practically his whole army, but they're sitting there unable to do anything. It's just an amazing combination. So once again, we see the power of the discovered check, the power of the 2-for-1 move that forces black to defend 2 things at once. And we've seen particularly the idea of double checks as a especially strong kind of a discovered check. Now, just to reinforce this lesson of the double check, I'd like to show you another example of a double check. Okay, our next example of a double check is actually another very important chess pattern that, if you don't know about it, definitely worth knowing, called Philidor's Legacy. So we're getting to see some really great classical stuff in this lecture. You saw the windmill attack, and now you're going to see something else called Philidor's Legacy. So here we have a game that took place in 1990 between Jan Timman, a Dutch grandmaster, as white, and Nigel Short, an English grandmaster, as black. And we're at, I think, the 25th move for white, something like that. And so anyway, it's white to move. And if we look at this position, we can see what's going on. Black has just moved his rook to e8, and basically what he's hoping for is he's hoping to win white's pawn on e7, which is, you know, a very dangerous pawn. It's 1 square away from queening. Unfortunately, black just doesn't have time for that because white has a very strong move here, queen to c4 check. All right, so black has only one defense to the check, which is to move his king to h8. And now take a look at this position and see what you do for white. Actually, white has a couple of strong moves. Queen to f7 is actually a very good move and wins for white, but there's an even better move for white here, which is knight to f7 check. This is a really good pattern for you to learn because it comes up a lot. The queen and the knight combining to attack the king. Okay, once you have a castle king where this diagonal is open from a2 to g8, if you can put your queen on that diagonal and you can bring your knight to g5 or to e5 and then into f7, then this combination is almost always there. It's sort of cookbook combination. So knight to f7 check. Black again has only one move, which is king to g8. And now we have the double check, knight to h6 check, attacking the king with both the knight and the queen. So black cannot go pawn takes knight because he's got to defend against the queen check. So again, the only move, king to h8. And now white wins with a beautiful queen sacrifice, queen to g8 check. All right, so black cannot take the queen with the king because the queen is defended by the knight. So his only move is rook takes queen, and now we get smothered mate, knight to f7 checkmate. Black's king has no moves because it's surrounded by his own pieces. So if you've never seen this, it's an incredibly gorgeous and also important idea. Okay, so the smothered mate, and not only the smothered mate is important, but also this whole pattern that led up to it, the pattern of Philidor's legacy, which is the queen check along the diagonal and the knight coming in from g5 with knight to f7 check, and setting up this beautiful little combination of the double check and the checkmate. So absolutely, if you haven't seen this before, this is something to memorize because it's a very useful thing to know. Comes up quite a bit. All right, so far the examples we've looked at make it look as if discovered checks are always this monster tactic that always wins. And in fact, we've seen some gorgeous examples. We've seen 4 queen sacrifices where the winning side was able to actually give up a whole queen because of the power of the discovered check. And in our other example, there weren't any queen sacrifices, but that was the Petrov Defense example where white won a queen with the discovered check. So I just wanted to show you one example where the discovered check doesn't really work and kind of actually sort of backfired. And this is an example from a game of mine, very recent game that, in fact, I played in this tournament that I told you about earlier in the lecture that I just finished, the Santa Cruz Cup. So this was a game in the semi-final match where that qualified me to go on to the final. And I'm black, and my opponent is Elon Benjamin, an expert. He's playing white. He's a good friend of mine, and in fact, I showed one of my games against him in a previous chess lecture of mine as well. So we seem to have a lot of interesting games. So if we look at this position, you can see that the white has given up the exchange, but he's gotten a lot of attacking possibilities for the exchange. In fact, he's already won a pawn for the exchange. He has a powerful pass pawn on e5. And what white should do here is simply win a second pawn with rook takes pawn, now creating a pass pawn on a5 as well. And really, black would have no chance to win this position because, for example, if he plays rook to e1 check and white moves his king, black cannot play rook takes pawn because white would get a nice fork, knight to d7 check, winning the rook and winning the game. So in fact, in this position, black probably has nothing better than to just keep on checking and get a draw that way. But what happened is kind of interesting. So we've just finished move 40, which means that the time control has just passed. So white has all the time he wants to think about this move. But he didn't think for very long. In fact, he only thought for a few seconds, and then he banged out the move, knight to d7 check, really slamming the piece down on the board. And I'm sure he thought this was the winning move. And in fact, I thought so too for about half a minute. I actually sat there and thought, well, should I resign? Now, why does this look like such a strong move? Okay, well, if black plays king to g8, one point of this move is that white would then play knight to f6 check with a fork on the king and rook. And so white would win the rook for the knight, and white would basically have a winning position. He'd be one pawn up already and win another pawn on a7, and it'd just be total win for white. So that's no good. And if black moves his king up, say to e7, then we get the discovered check, knight to f6 check. And I'm sure that my opponent, Elon, looked at this, and it's psychological. It looks so strong. Okay, so discovered check, and again, white is going to win the rook. So, So I'm sitting here thinking, oh my God, this is really hopeless. And then I look at, well, what happens if I go king to f7? And then the more I look at it, the more I realize it isn't hopeless after all, because after white plays, whoops, that's what he did play, but after white plays knight to f6 check, here we see the 2-for-1 move. White's attacking black's king with his rook. He's attacking black's rook with his knight. So it looks like he's going to win, but black has a 2-for-1 defense, which is to play rook to e7. And all of a sudden, there's nothing for black to worry about. Everything's defended. And if white goes rook takes rook check, king takes rook, it's true that white can snatch a pawn on h7, but now we get to an endgame where black is easily winning. Black just goes rook to a1. White cannot defend his pawn on a5, and black will just simply push his a-pawn, and it'll be impossible for white's knight to defend. The knight is just too far away. So this would actually be an easy win for black. So after I played king to f7, this must have come as quite a shock to my opponent, and he in fact here played a very clever move which should still have saved a draw for him. He played knight to g8 check. So, remember, discovered check, your piece can go anywhere it wants. It's like got a free ticket to anywhere on the board. And the reason he plays to b8 is that he's actually heading for c3. And why is this important? Well, I played rook to e7, naturally. And now white should have played a6, which would have been good enough to save the draw. Why is that? Well, actually, because there's a neat little trap here. If I had played rook takes rook, and pawn takes rook, and then rook to b1, trying to win the pawn, white actually has knight to c3. This threatens b8, queening the pawn, so black has to take, and then white would go knight to d8 with a fork on the king and rook, and white would win the game. Okay, so a beautiful little trap. Now, actually, I saw this during the game, and so if he had played a6, I would not have played rook takes rook. I would have instead gone rook to e1 check, and once again, we would likely end up with a draw by perpetual check. But for some reason, my opponent didn't see this, and he played rook takes rook check. I go king takes rook, and now we again get to a situation where he's able to win a pawn. Knight c6 check, followed by knight takes pawn. But again, the position is a loss for white because the rook is much stronger than the knight. I played rook to rook to a1 here. He goes knight to b5. I go rook takes pawn, attacking the knight. He goes knight back to d4, and I go rook to a2. And at this point, I'll stop because this is, again, too much of a digression. But basically, black is winning here because white cannot defend his pawns on the king's side and also defend the pawn on e4. So he's got to give up one or the other. And if he gives up the pawn on e5, then it's just going to be a very slow, grinded out victory for black. Basically, rook and 2 pawns against knight and 2 pawns should be a win for black. And so, in fact, I did eventually win this game. So just going back to the original position, what do I want you to get out of this? The thing I want to get you to get out of it, to learn from this, is that, whoops, I went back too far, sorry. Right, so in this position, you just need to be a little careful with discovered checks, that just because you have a discovered check does not mean the game is over. It does not mean you're going to win. And vice versa, if you have to move into a discovered check, it's scary to move into a discovered check, but it isn't always the end of the world. Sometimes you may be just fine. If the opponent can't attack anything, or if his 2-for-1 attack is easily defended with a 2-for-1 defense, then it might be okay. So a little dose of reality here. I hope you've enjoyed these examples of discovered checks and discovered attacks, and I hope you get a few chances to play them in your own game. For now, this is Dana McKenzie signing off.